Let's bow our heads for prayer. Wonderful Heavenly Father, we thank you for the privilege this day of coming into your presence to open your holy word and learn the lessons that you have for us. And as we speak about the identity of Babylon in your holy Bible, we ask, Father, that you will give us open hearts, for we're going to speak about some very direct and important things. So I ask that you'll especially be with those who will be watching this on television, those who will be watching this through DVDs in their living rooms. I ask, Lord, that you will give them willing hearts to receive the message of truth that you have for us today. And we thank you beforehand for answering our prayer, because we come boldly to your throne in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. I'd like to do a little bit of review before we actually begin our study of the identity of Babylon. I'd like to just mention that the first angel's message, as we have seen, goes to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And the question is, why does it go to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people? Well, the answer is that Revelation chapter 17, as we're going to study, speaks about a great harlot who is seated upon multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. In other words, the role of the first angel's message is to call those multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples to come out of Babylon and to join God's faithful people. Because the expression is the same in the first angel's message. It goes to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, and the harlot is seated upon every kindred, nation, tongue, and people. So the first angel's message has the intent of calling God's faithful people out of Babylon. Now let's review what we've studied in the first angel's message. We noticed, first of all, that the everlasting gospel shows us that Jesus Christ lived the perfect life that we should live. And Jesus fully and completely paid the debt of sin. There is no more payment that is needed for sin. Our sins were totally paid for at the cross of Calvary. But we've noticed also that the first angel's message makes commands or demands upon those who receive the everlasting gospel. For example, the first angel's message tells us to fear God. And as we've noticed, this entails a deep respect for God, such a deep respect for God that we're willing to obey His commandments or His law. We also notice that the first angel's message commands us to give glory to God. And as we studied this, we noticed that this tells us that we're supposed to reveal the glorious character of God in our lives, the character attributes of God. And it also includes taking care of our bodies and our minds, because the Apostle Paul says that we're supposed to glorify God with our body and with our spirit, which belong to God. We also noticed that the first angel's message tells us that we are now in the hour of God's judgment, and that that judgment is transpiring before the second coming of Jesus in heaven, which means that if the judgment is taking place in heaven right now, before Jesus comes, it must mean that those individuals who died have not gone to heaven. They have not gone to hell when they died, because God would not give them their reward before they were judged. Clearly, the Bible tells us that Jesus brings His reward when He comes, which entails a judgment before He comes. And so the first angel's message is directly related to the doctrine of the state of the dead. When the dead die, when people die, they go to the grave. Jesus judges them through the records in the books before His second coming, and then at the second coming, He brings His reward, which means that the judgment message shows us that the dead are sleeping until the moment that Jesus resurrects them to give them their reward. We also noticed that God expects His people to worship Him. And we noticed that the sign of worship to the Creator is His holy Sabbath. And so the first angel's message teaches us many important things. It teaches us the importance of keeping God's law, that we're in the judgment now, that we need to keep God's holy Sabbath, that we need to take care of our bodies, that we need to take care of our minds, and many other things. Very important messages for these last days. Now I want you to notice the second angel's message. It's found in Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8. Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8. And another angel followed. Notice the sequence. We have to preach the second angel's message before we preach after we preach the first, never before. We can't reverse the order, in other words. It says in Revelation 14, verse 8, and another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city. Now, notice the expressions. Babylon is fallen, is fallen. When the Bible repeats something, it means that it is really fallen. When God repeats something, it's because it wants to intensify the expression. In other words, Babylon is really fallen, and you'll notice that Babylon is called that great city. Now, why did Babylon fall? Notice the last part of verse 8. It says, because, here's the reason why Babylon falls, because she has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. In other words, Babylon has fallen, truly fallen, because Babylon gives wine to the inhabitants of the earth, and they become drunk with the wine of her fornication. In other words, we need to understand that the reason why Babylon falls is because she gives wine to the nations instead of accepting the first angel's message. You see, the reason why Babylon falls is because she rejected the first angel's message. The first angel's message has the truth of God. The wine of Babylon is the error of Babylon. In other words, they are opposites. The first angel's message is God's message. The wine of Babylon is the devil's message. And the reason why Babylon falls is because she gives her wine to the nations in contrast to the truths that we find revealed in the first angel's message. Now, in our study today, we are going to analyze what is Babylon. And then in the next two sermons in this series, we're going to study what is Babylon's wine. And then the third in this short series of three that deals specifically with Babylon, we're going to talk about Babylon's fornication. And so today, what is Babylon? Our next topic, what is Babylon's wine? And then, what is Babylon's fornication? Now, I must tell you that the Babylon that we're going to study is not the Babylon of Genesis 11. That is the original Babylon. We're going to study primarily what is known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The Neo-Babylonian Empire is the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylon of the book of Daniel. And you say, why are we not going to go all the way back to Genesis 11? Why are we going to take the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar as our basis for study? The reason is simple. The book of Revelation draws primarily upon the stories that we find in Daniel that deal with the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar. Let me give you three examples. Revelation 13 and verse 2, we find some very interesting powers mentioned, and I'd like to invite you to go with me there. Revelation chapter 13 and verse 2. It says, now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. Let me ask you, where do you first find those beasts that are mentioned in this verse? You find them in Daniel 7. So what Babylon is in the background of this verse? It's not the Babylon of Genesis 11, it's the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar. Another example. Revelation 13, 11 to 18, and we're not going to read the verses. There it speaks about a beast who raises up an image. He commands everyone to worship the image of the beast, and whoever does not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Let me ask you, where is the background of that story? Well, you know it's in Daniel chapter 3, where Nebuchadnezzar, who for a while lived like a beast, raised an image, commanded everyone to worship the image, and whoever would not worship the image would be killed. In other words, once again, Revelation chapter 13 has as its background the Daniel's Babylon and not the Babylon of Genesis chapter 11. And then, of course, a third story that we have is the fall of Babylon in Daniel 5, when the Euphrates River was dried up by Cyrus, who came from the east, if you read Isaiah and the prophecies of Jeremiah, and as a result, God's people were delivered from Babylon when Babylon fell because her river dried up. Well, if you go to Revelation chapter 16, you find that the sixth plague describes the drying up of the river Euphrates. Once again, the book of Revelation is drawing upon the Babylon that we find in the book of Daniel. Now, we could spend a whole lecture just to talk about the Babylon of Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, where the tongues were confused. There's a lot of things that we could study there, but we don't have the time to add another lecture to this series that we're studying. So we're going to dwell primarily upon the Babylon that is mentioned in the book of Daniel, because that's where the book of Revelation draws upon. Now, in order to understand what Babylon is, we have to go to the Old Testament and study the history of Israel. Let me ask you, was Israel God's chosen people? Absolutely. And I'm going to describe now, in broad strokes, the history of Israel. From the times of the Exodus, particularly Mount Sinai, till the time of the Babylonian captivity, when Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the city and took Israel captive. Let's begin by analyzing the marriage of God with Israel. Did you know that God married Israel? Notice Exodus chapter 19 and verses 4 through 6. Exodus chapter 19 and verses 4 through 6. Here Israel is at the foot of Mount Sinai. And God wants to make a covenant with Israel. He wants to get married with Israel. So God is proposing. Notice Exodus 19, 4 through 6. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. Here God is speaking to Moses, saying, I want you to relay a message to Israel for me. I want you to ask them if they want to make a covenant with me, if they want to get married with me. Because I took them out of Egypt. I loved them. I delivered them. Now I want them to be my special people. I want to spiritually marry these people. So go down and ask them if they're willing to marry me. Notice the response of Israel in Exodus chapter 19, verses 7 and 8. Moses comes down, it says, so Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded him. Then all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. So Moses brought back the words of the people to whom? The words of the people to the Lord. And now you have a covenant. You have a marriage relationship between God and Israel. By the way, who is the husband in this relationship? It is God who is the husband, and Israel is the bride. Now, I want you to notice that marriage always has obligations, doesn't it? There are certain laws that apply to marriage. One of those laws is faithfulness to the wedding vows. Now, where do we find the wedding vows of Israel? What God expected from his bride or from his wife. Notice Exodus chapter 20 and verses 1 and 2. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. In other words, I delivered you. I love you. You know, it's not because you were good, but because of my grace and because of my love for you that I took you out of Egypt. And therefore, now I want you to be my people. I want you to be my peculiar treasure. I want you to be my wife. But there are certain laws of marriage which must be obeyed. So what does Jesus then give Israel? He gives them what? The Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are the law of marriage. It's what God expects from Israel. It's what God expects from the marriage. He expects his bride, or he expects his wife, to be faithful to him. Now, we're not going to read the Ten Commandments. You have them on your sheets, and you've read many times the Ten Commandments. But I want you to remember that the Ten Commandments are the law of marriage. And by the way, you know, does God make some promises to his bride too? Oh, you notice several of the commandments promise a blessing if Israel obeys those commandments, right? And so it's a two-way street. God is saying, this is the law of marriage. So I want you to be faithful to me, and I'm going to be faithful to you. In other words, we'll preserve ourselves one for another. Now you say, Pastor, where does the Bible actually use the word marriage for what happened between God and Israel? Go with me to Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 32, which is reminiscing about what happened at Mount Sinai. I want to show you that God married Israel at Mount Sinai. And he wanted Israel to be faithful to him. And he promised to be faithful to Israel. But it was a two-way street. Jeremiah 31 and verse 32. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke. What event is being described in these verses? The covenant that God made where? At Mount Sinai. What did Israel do with that covenant? They broke it. But now notice what it continues saying. Once again, going back a little ways to verse 32. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke. Now listen to this. Though I was a husband to them, says the Lord. What was God to Israel? The husband. And what was Israel? Israel was the bride. Unfortunately, God was faithful with Israel, but Israel was unfaithful to God. In fact, I want you to notice Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 8, where God reminisces about the fact that he chose Israel to be his wife. Notice how God proudly says, "You were mine." Ezekiel 16 and verse 8. God is reminiscing. He says, when I passed by you again and looked upon you, indeed your time was the time of love. See, when I met you, it was a time for love. So I spread my wing over you and covered your nakedness. Yes, I swore an oath to you. See, these are the wedding vows. I swore an oath to you and entered into a covenant with you, and you became mine, says the Lord God. Can you hear the pride in God's voice? He's saying, you were mine. But soon, Israel decided that she would have a relationship with other lovers. In other words, she started committing adultery or fornication with the surrounding nations. She was unfaithful to her wedding vows. In fact, let's notice Ezekiel chapter 16. There are several verses that I want us to read there. And I want you to remember these details because later on in our study, we're going to go to Revelation chapter 17. And we're going to find the same details all over again. Notice Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 2. Son of man, cause Jerusalem to know her what? Her abominations. By the way, in Ezekiel chapter 16, the word abominations is used repeatedly. It's also used in the book of Ezekiel. The children of Israel now were committing abominations. Notice Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 14. Israel became proud of her beauty, and she thought that her beauty was her own. Notice verse 14. Your fame went out among the nations because of your beauty, for it was perfect. And now notice, through my splendor, which I bestowed on you, says the Lord. Why was Israel beautiful? Because God beautified Israel. It wasn't because Israel was beautiful in herself. And Israel started thinking that she was so beautiful, and she started committing the abominations of the nations, which we'll talk more about in our next study together. In fact, the Bible says that Israel became a harlot. Notice Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 15. Here God is talking about His own people, folks. He's not talking about pagans or atheists. He's talking about those who profess to be the church of God in the Old Testament. Ezekiel 16, verse 15. But you trusted in your own beauty, played the harlot because of your fame, and poured out your harlotry on everyone passing by who would have it. In other words, you became a harlot. God is calling His people what? His apostate people, He's calling them a harlot because they're committing these abominations in their midst, the abominations of the nations. I want you to notice that God's people had attired themselves with all these jewels of gold and silver and wanted to attract attention to themselves. Notice Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 17. Don't forget all these details. We're going to come back to them. Ezekiel 16 and verse 17. You also have taken your beautiful jewelry from my gold and my silver, which I had given you, and made for yourself male images and played the harlot with them. What did they use the gold and silver for? To make what? To make jewelry, to attract attention to themselves. Notice Ezekiel chapter 23 and verse 40. You should also read Ezekiel 23. The whole chapter is parallel to Ezekiel 16. It says there in Ezekiel 23 verse 40, furthermore, you sent for men to come from afar, to whom a messenger was sent, and they came, and you washed yourself for them, painted your eyes, and adorned yourself with what? With ornaments. Did this harlot deck herself with gold and silver and precious stones? Absolutely. To attract attention to whom? To God? No, to attract attention to herself. And she plays the harlot according to Scripture. She fornicated with the nations. Several of these nations are mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 16. In other words, God's holy, peculiar, special people now started forming relationships with these pagan nations, with these secular nations. For example, Babylon, the Assyrians. It actually began in the days of Solomon, when Solomon had 1,000 women in his life, many of them because of alliances that he made with the surrounding nations. That's what the fornication was. Instead of Israel preserving herself only for the Lord, now Israel had other lovers, which were all of these nations with which she had illicit relationships. Notice Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 26. You also committed harlotry. That word is in Ezekiel 16 all the time. You also committed harlotry with the Egyptians, your very fleshly neighbors, and increased your acts of harlotry to provoke me to anger. Notice chapter 16 and verse 28. It also says that she played the harlot with the Assyrians. It said you also played the harlot with the Assyrians because you were insatiable. Indeed, you played the harlot with them, still were not satisfied. In other words, Israel has all of these lovers. She can't get enough of these lovers from all of the nations. She's committing spiritual adultery. In other words, she's fornicating with the kings of the earth, if you please. She also fornicated with Chaldea, that is with Babylon. Notice Ezekiel 16, verse 29. Moreover, you multiplied your acts of harlotry as far as the land of the traitor, Chaldea. And even then you were not satisfied. She could not be satisfied. She wanted all of the nations of the earth to have illicit relationships with her, and she abandoned the husband of her youth. In fact, notice Ezekiel 16, verse 32. If you still don't believe that this is a relationship between a husband and a wife, and Israel is the harlot because she has chosen to link up with the nations and adopt their practices, notice Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 32. God explicitly says, you are an adulterous wife who takes strangers instead of her husband. That couldn't be any clearer, could it? Now, I want you to notice that Israel, in her fornication, she defiled God's sanctuary and she trampled on God's holy Sabbath. Notice Ezekiel chapter 23 and verses 38 and 39. Ezekiel 23, verses 38 and 39. Moreover, they have done this to me, God says. They have defiled my sanctuary on the same day and profaned my Sabbaths. Did they contaminate the sanctuary? Is there anything in Daniel about the sanctuary being defiled? Absolutely. And they profaned my Sabbaths. For after they had slain their children for their idols, on the same day they came into my sanctuary to profane it. And indeed, thus they have done in the midst of my house. Do you know what else they were doing? Israel was shedding innocent blood. She was a murderous wife. Notice what it says in Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 45. Ezekiel 16 and verse 45. But righteous men will judge them after the manner of adulteresses, and after the manner of women who what? Who shed blood. What did Israel do? They shed blood because they are adulteresses, and blood is on their hands. Interesting. But do you know that Israel wasn't the only one who was doing this? Israel had daughters. You say, how's this? Go with me to Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 48. She had daughters that were committing the same sins as she was. Notice Ezekiel 16 and verse 48. As I live, says the Lord God, neither your sister Sodom nor her daughters have done as you and your daughters have done. So does Israel have daughters according to this that are practicing acts of harlotry also? Absolutely. And therefore God says to his wife, I'm going to pour out my wrath upon you. Notice Ezekiel 23 and verses 32 to 34. In fact, God says, I'm going to give you the cup of my wrath. Is there anything in Revelation about God giving a cup of his wrath? Yes, there is. Notice Ezekiel 23 verses 32 through 34. Thus says the Lord God, you shall drink of your sister's cup, the deep and wide one. You shall be laughed to scorn and held in derision. It contains much. You will be filled with the cup of your sister Samaria. You shall drink and drain it. You shall break its shards and tear at your own breasts, for I have spoken, says the Lord. She was going to drink the cup of the wrath of God because of her abominations and because of her harlotries. But there's another interesting detail. We're told in Ezekiel 16, verse 39, that God's people were going to be hated by the very kings that they were committing fornication with. Notice Ezekiel 16, verse 39. I will also give you into their hand, and they shall throw down your shrines and break down your high places. And now notice the terminology. They shall also strip you of your clothes, take off your beautiful jewelry, and leave you what? Naked and bare. What were the kings going to do, the ones that she fornicated with? They themselves were going to arise against her to make her naked and bare. And so God told Israel, his chosen people, his bride, who had become a harlot, who was practicing the abominations of the nations, who was fornicating, who used all of her luxurious jewelry to attract attention to herself, and who was profaning the Sabbaths of the Lord and was contaminating the sanctuary of the Lord. God said, I'm going to send destruction upon this city. Ezekiel chapter 7, verses 1 through 4 describes the sentence that God dictates upon his people. Ezekiel 7, verses 1 through 4, moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, and you, son of man, thus says the Lord God to the land of Israel, an end. The end has come upon the four corners of the land. Let me ask you, does the book of Revelation talk about the end coming from the four corners of the earth? when the angels released the winds? See, we're dealing with biblical types here of things that are going to happen in the future. What happened literally to Israel locally is going to happen on a global scale at the end of time. Notice verse 3. Now the end has come upon you, and I will send my anger against you. I will judge you according to your ways. I will repay you for all your what? Abominations. Don't forget that word. My eye will not spare you, nor will I have pity, but I will repay your ways, and your abominations will be seen in your midst. Then you shall know that I am the Lord. And do you know what the greatest abomination was that was being committed immediately before the city was destroyed? Notice Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 16. Ezekiel chapter 8, and let's begin our reading at verse 15 for the context. Notice the greatest abomination. Ezekiel chapter 8 is called the chapter of the abominations. And the reason why is because God shows Ezekiel an abomination, and Ezekiel says, wow, Lord, that's pretty bad. God says, you haven't seen anything yet. I'm going to show you an abomination that's worse than this one. And so God shows him a worse abomination. And Ezekiel says, Lord, this is terrible. God says, you haven't seen anything yet. I'm going to show you one that's worse. And what do we find as the worst abomination of all? Notice Ezekiel 8, verse 16. Then he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Turn again, you will see greater abominations than these. So he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house. And there, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they were worshiping the sun towards the east. What was the greatest abomination that was being committed among those who professed to be God's people? They were worshiping what? They were worshiping the sun. Does that have any end-time significance? It most certainly does. We're going to study that later on. Verse 17. And he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations? Notice the word again, the abominations which they commit here. For they have filled the land with violence. Then they have returned to provoke me to anger. Indeed, they put the branch to the nose. In other words, they snubbed their nose at the Lord. Therefore, I also will act in fury. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. Though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them. God is saying this about his beloved bride who has become a harlot and has adopted the abominations of the nations and is proud of all of her wonderful jewels and fornicates with the kings of the earth. This is not some pagan nation. God is rebuking his bride, his wife. Now let me ask you, were there faithful people in Jerusalem? Was everybody apostate? Was everybody a harlot? Absolutely not. Before the destruction of the city, did God say that he was going to do a work of separating the righteous from the unrighteous? A judgment? Absolutely. Ezekiel chapter 9. Ezekiel chapter 9 and verse 1. Then he called out in my hearing with a loud voice, saying, let those who have charge over the city draw near, each with a deadly weapon in his hand. In other words, these messengers are coming to execute God's judgment. And suddenly 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with his battle axe in his hand, in other words, with a weapon in his hand, because they're going to execute God's wrath upon this unfaithful wife who has broken the marriage covenant. One man among them was clothed with linen and had a writer's inkhorn at his side. In other words, he had a seal. They went in and stood beside the bronze altar. Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub where it had been to the threshold of the temple. And he called to the man clothed with linen who had the writer's inkhorn at his side. And the Lord said to him, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark. Where? Is there a mark in Revelation on the forehead? Absolutely. Put a mark on the foreheads of the men who what? Sigh and cry over all the abominations that are done within it. Was everybody worshiping the sun? No. There were some faithful ones that were not worshiping the sun. And what is told to this man who has the writer's inkhorn is, put a seal on those who are not practicing the abominations, those who are not worshiping the sun. Do you see the contrast between the sun worshipers and those who have the mark on their foreheads? Very interesting. Notice verse 5. To the others he said in my hearing, go after him through the city and kill. That's after the sign of protection has been placed. Go after him through the city and kill. Do not let your eyes spare, nor have any pity. Utterly slay old and young men, maidens and little children, and women, but do not come near anyone on whom is the mark. And begin at my sanctuary. That is where the ministers were. So they began with the elders who were before the temple. The punishment began with the religious leaders because they led God's people into idolatry and into these practices. And this was fulfilled. This punishment was fulfilled when Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and took the people captive. Let's read about it in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verses 15 through 18. It says there, and the Lord God of their fathers sent warnings to them by his messengers, rising up early and sending them because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy. Therefore, he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men. Do you remember Ezekiel chapter 9? Don't spare. Kill young men, maidens, kill children, everything. Notice what it says, verse 17. Therefore he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, had no compassion on young man or virgin, on the aged or the weak. He gave them all into his hand. Is this a sad story? This is a very sad story. In other words, Israel fulfilled the prophecy of Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 23 and became a harlot, and therefore the husband destroyed them. Of course, this could never happen to the Christian church. Do you think? It only could happen to Israel. It could never happen to the Christian church. You think? Let's go now and examine this concept with the New Testament church. New Testament Israel. Let me ask you, did Jesus marry his people when he came to this earth? Yes, he did. In a certain sense, he married them. He formed a covenant relationship with them. Notice Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25 to 27. Ephesians 5, 25 to 27. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also what? Also loved the church and gave himself for her. So the relationship between husband and wife is used to illustrate the relationship between Jesus Christ and his what? Church. Jesus is the husband and his church is the what? Is the bride. Notice 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 2. 2 Corinthians 11 verse 2. Here it's explicit. The Apostle Paul says, speaking about the Corinthian church, for I am jealous for you with godly jealousy. For I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. Let me ask you, was the early church, the earliest church, a pure church? It was most certainly a pure church. Was it in a proper covenant relationship with Jesus Christ? You can read the book Acts of the Apostles, folks. It was a pure church. It was a conquering church, represented by the white horse, going out conquering and to conquer. It instilled terror in the hearts of sinners because of the righteousness and holiness of those who belong to the church. But then something happened. Apostasy came into the church. Notice 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. By the way, this is talking about the Antichrist, and we're going to deal with the Antichrist later in this series. We're going to talk about the beast. Notice 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 and 4. It says, let no one deceive you by any means. For that day, that means the day of the coming of Jesus, that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. The expression falling away is one Greek word, and the word is apostasia, where we get our English word apostasy. In other words, Jesus will not come until the apostasy comes first. And the man of sin is revealed. What is sin? Remember this, transgression of the law. It's going to be a man who is going to say that it's okay to transgress the law of God. He's going to play games with the holy law of God. And it says, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. Do you know the only other person in the Bible who's called the son of perdition? Judas Iscariot. Was Judas an outsider? Was Judas some pagan that warred against Jesus Christ from outside? No. He even betrayed Jesus with a kiss. In other words, the Antichrist is not going to arise from without. He's going to arise from where? From within the church, just like with Israel. And it says in verse 4, notice what this Antichrist is going to do, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshiped, so that he sits as God. Is he going to proclaim himself to be God? Absolutely. We're going to notice in the prophecy about the beast that he speaks blasphemies against God. And blasphemy is when an individual who is a mere man claims to be God. And so it says that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Do you know what the temple of God is? A lot of people today are looking to the Middle East. They say, oh, the Jewish temple has to be rebuilt. But every other place that the Apostle Paul uses that expression, temple of God, he's referring to the Christian church. For example, Ephesians 2, verses 19 to 21. He speaks of the Ephesians as being the temple of God. We read from 1 Corinthians chapter 6 where it says that we are the temple. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 says that the church of Corinth is the temple. In other words, the temple is not that temple in the Middle East, because Jesus says, your house is left unto you desolate. The temple is the church. So let me ask you, where was the apostasy going to arise? It was going to arise where? In the church. And the book of Revelation describes this end-time apostasy of the Christian church. I want you to notice Revelation chapter 17. We're going to see the characteristics here. You're going to now see some similarities with what we studied from Israel in the Old Testament. Revelation chapter 17, verse 1. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying, come, I will show you the judgment of the great what? Of the great harlot who sits on many waters. Oh, that great harlot must be Iraq. In the light of what we studied from the history of Israel, would this be some pagan nation, or would this be those who profess to be God's people? It must be those who profess to be God's people, because it speaks of a great harlot. And by the way, let me tell you something. I'm not going to identify who the great harlot is today. But by the characteristics, you're going to know who it is. And later on in this series, we are going to study a little bit more and identify what this power is. Now notice who this harlot is. Chapter 17 and verse 5 of Revelation. And on her forehead a name was written. Mystery. What is the name of this harlot? Mystery. Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. What is the name of this harlot? Her name is what? Her name is Mystery. Babylon the what? The Great. Does this have any relationship with the second angel's message? The second angel's message says, Babylon is fallen, that great city. Here, it says that this harlot's name is what? Babylon. By the way, we're told also in Revelation 17, verse 1, that she sits upon many waters. What does the act of sitting mean? The act of sitting means that she rules. Notice, chapter 17 and verse 1. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits, where? On many waters. Now, sitting on many waters would mean that she rules over the waters. But what do the waters represent? Notice Revelation 17 and verse 15. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 15. It says, then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. Let me ask you, is she ruling basically globally? Yes. Revelation 13 says that the whole world wondered after the what? The beast, who is the same as the harlot, we're going to notice. And so we have to find a harlot church, because a harlot represents a fallen church, according to what we've studied. It has to be a church that is what? global or worldwide, but there's more. It has to be a church that is involved with the nations, with the political nations of the world. Notice Revelation chapter 17 and verse 2. Revelation chapter 17 verse 2. It's not only a church, it's not only a fallen church, it fornicates with the kings of the earth, just like Israel did. It says in Revelation 17 verse 2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Let me ask you, does she fornicate with the kings of the earth just like Israel did? Absolutely. But I want you to notice that she also has daughters. Did we notice that about Israel? Notice Revelation chapter 17 and verse 5. Revelation 17 verse 5. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. Do we have the word abominations here too? We have the word fornication. We have the word harlot. She controls the many waters of the world, nations, multitudes, tongues, and peoples. Absolutely. And by the way, if she's a mother, she must have daughters, because I don't know the first mother that never had children. I know women who didn't have children. But mothers have children. And because she's a harlot, her daughters are also harlots. Now notice that she gives wine to the nations. Revelation 17 and verse 2. With whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. You just have to accept by faith what I'm going to say now. The wine represents her false teachings in contradiction to the first angel's message. She fell because she rejected the first angel's message. The wine is the opposite of the first angel's message. We're going to study that in our next lecture. In other words, she gives her false teachings and her false practices to the nations, and she makes them what? Drunk. That's why when you preach the truth, people don't want to accept it. It's almost impossible to give a Bible study to a drunk. Of course, we're speaking about spiritual drunkenness. We're not talking about literal drunkenness. I want you to notice how this harlot is dressed. Revelation 17 verse 4. Let me ask you, was Israel dressed with gold and with silver and her ornaments and everything? Yeah. Notice Revelation 17 verse 4. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet. And adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of, here it is again, full of what? Abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. Is she decked with jewelry? She most certainly is. Does she want to impress her lovers with her riches and her looks? Absolutely. She's a global system. And everybody's impressed because of all of the riches and all of the wonderful, the gold and the silver that she has. And by the way, you notice that the colors that she majors in are purple and scarlet. Never blue. Because as we're going to notice in our next lecture, blue represents the law of God. And this system is contrary to God's holy law. Now, I want you to notice also that this woman is an assassin. You know, this woman has killed God's people. Did we find that of Israel in the Old Testament? We most certainly did. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 6. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. Now I want to show you something which is very important for what we're going to study in the future. This harlot is only one part of Babylon. She's the main protagonist of Babylon. But Babylon in Revelation is composed of three parts. Are you understanding what I'm saying? She is, for example, like Jezebel. You know, Jezebel was the key figure. She manipulated everything, and her false prophets did what she said, and the king, King Ahab, did what she said. But she was the main power behind the king and behind the false prophets. It's kind of like John the Baptist. Do you know John the Baptist also had three enemies? It looks like the devil works in groups of three. Because with John the Baptist, was there a king that was involved? Yes. Was there a mother that was involved? Yes. Was there a daughter who was involved? Yes. You see, this story in Revelation is actually prefigured by the story of Elijah, and it's prefigured by the story of the death of John the Baptist. In other words, if you know how the different actors interplayed in the story of Elijah and in the story of John the Baptist, the three enemies of Elijah and John the Baptist, you're going to know how everything is going to pan out at the end of time. We don't have time to get into Elijah and John the Baptist. We'd have to have one lecture for each in order to understand how the relationship between these three enemies in the days of Elijah and these three enemies in the days of John the Baptist prefigure perfectly what's going to happen at the end of time. But I want you to notice that Babylon has three parts. Revelation 16 and verse 19. It says there in Revelation 16, verse 19, "Now the great city was divided into" what? Into three parts. What is the great city? Babylon, right? We've already identified the great city as Babylon. The great city was divided into three parts. So how many parts does Babylon have? Three. And in case you're wondering whether the expression "the great city" is referring to Babylon, let's continue reading. "And the cities of the nations fell, and great" what? "Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath." Is God going to pour out his wrath upon Babylon like he did upon Israel in the Old Testament because of her abominations, because of her fornication, because of the wine that she gives to the nations, etc., because she shed innocent blood? Absolutely. This is a repetition of history. But at the end, it's global. In other words, the history of Israel is a model in miniature. It's a small-scale model of what is going to happen on a global scale at the end of time. Now you say, what are the three parts of Babylon? Revelation 16 and verses 13 and 14. Revelation 16, 13, and 14. It says, "And I saw three unclean spirits like frogs coming out of the mouth of the dragon." There's one. "Out of the mouth of the beast." There's two. "And out of the mouth of whom?" Out of the mouth of the false prophet. What are the three parts of Babylon? The dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. In lecture number 10 of this series, we're going to talk about the beast. In lecture number 11, we're going to talk about the false prophet. And in several lectures, we're going to talk about the dragon. You see, the beast is the same as the harlot. The false prophet is the same as the harlot's daughters. And the dragon is the same as the kings. In other words, at the end of time, there's going to be a threefold alliance between the beast or the harlot, the false prophet and the daughters, and the kings or the dragon. And they're going to all join together in opposition against God's people. Those are the three parts of Babylon. But who is the main protagonist of the story? Who is the one who's moving all the strings? It is the harlot or the beast. Because the Bible says that the whole world wondered after the beast. It says that the harlot sits upon multitudes, nations, tongues, and peoples. In other words, the beast and the harlot do the same thing. They control basically the world. And the kings go along, and the daughters also go along, just like in the story of Elijah. Now, let me ask you, are the kings eventually going to hate this system? Revelation 17, verse 16. Of course, all of this is coincidence. I don't think so. There's too many parallels. Revelation 17, verse 16. "And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast," those represent kings. You can read in Revelation 17. "These will" what? "Hate the harlot, make her desolate, and" what? "Naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire." Let me ask you, in the light of all of this, what does God invite his people to do? Let me ask you, are there a lot of God's people in these systems? Are there a lot of people that belong to this system which is known as the harlot? Oh, sure. Are there a lot of God's people in the system that's known as the false prophet? Absolutely. Are there many of God's people even among the kings of the earth or the rulers of the earth? Absolutely. So what does God say to them? Revelation 18, verses 1 to 5. "After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority. And the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become the dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. Does that sound like a place that you want to be? Now, why has Babylon become like that? Filled with demons and evil spirits. Verse 3, for, that means because all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Why is she filled with demons? Because every person has drunk her what? Her wine. So we need to know what the wine is. It says the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her. And the merchants, see, even the business people of the world, the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people. God has a people in this system. In this threefold system, God has a people. And God is calling them out, because notice what it continues saying. Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive her what? Her plagues. How many are her plagues? 7. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Question, is God going to have a faithful remnant at the end of time? Yes. What are they going to have on their forehead? The seal of God. What are the wicked going to have? Could that have something to do with sun worship? Are you understanding me or not? And what's going to happen to those who do not have the seal of God? They will be what? They will be destroyed by the wrath of God. That's why God, in His love, see, this is not a message of hate. In His love, God says, I have people in Babylon. Come out of her, my people. Don't stay in there, because if you stay in there, you're going to receive her plagues, because the plagues are for her. And of course, the big question is, will we accept the call of God and come out of Babylon and be among those who keep the commandments of God?